Hello, everyone. I'm Christina Giulio, Marketing Specialist here at Kids and Company. Thank you for taking the time today to join us. I want to welcome our speaker, Carrie, co-owner of Leaps and Bounds Pediatric Therapy. During today's talk, we'll explore sensory systems and their impact on a child's functioning, helping participants identify sensory processing challenges and discover supportive strategies for home and school. Webinar participants, if you have any questions throughout this session, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to address your questions during our live Q&A. So Carrie, it's off to you.
Thank you. Yeah, let me get my share screen. Okay, this is full disclosure, my first webinar. So not seeing people and just talking to myself is really strange. So I'm going to do my best. But thank you all for joining us. And thank you so much, Christina, for hosting today, and Kids and Company for the opportunity to share this information. So again, thanks for joining us, and we're going to get going. We're talking about navigating sensory needs for your child. And this is something obviously that's I'm passionate about. I've been practicing for over 25 years as an occupational therapist, and I've always specialized in treating kids with sensory processing challenges. And so I do want to say that I practice in St. Peters, Missouri. So I do follow the rules and regulations allowed by law in my state. So if you have any questions in your area, if you're not in my area, you're always welcome to email me, but I might direct you to an OT in your area. Okay, let's get going. So we learn through our senses. Everything we encounter requires the use of our senses. So everything we do each and every day requires your senses. Right now, you are sitting, you are using your auditory system to listen. You're using your visual system to either look at the screen or look around your room. You're using your sense of your body, of proprioception and vestibular sense of how you're sitting, where you're sitting. You're probably using your sense of smell and taste if you have a beverage or something in your mouth. So we're constantly using our senses for everything we do each day. And when I'm live, I always ask this question, how many senses do we have? And of course, the most common answer is 5. However, sometimes people will say 6, and I'll say, oh, tell me about that. And they'll say, the sixth sense. And actually, for years and years, my answer was always actually, we have 7. And one time someone answered 7. I said, oh, tell me about it. And they said, oh, I don't know. I just said 7. But now actually we do now talk about 8 senses. So we have our 5 basic senses that we're all familiar with. And we as OTs, and especially when we talk about sensory processing, also talk about the vestibular and proprioceptive senses. And now that 8th sense we often talk about is the interoception sense. And that's something we'll touch on briefly today at the end, because it's kind of a whole thing. Okay. So learning and life skills are a result of sensory processing. So the definition we use is sensory processing is the nervous system's ability to perceive sensory information, process it, and produce a response based on the interpretation of the information. So that's a lot of words. But really what that means is, let's say we were all in a room together. If we heard a fire alarm, so our sensory systems, our auditory system would perceive the sensory information. That's a sound, right? We would process it. We would compare it to our experience of what we know about that sound. We would determine if it's okay or not okay. We would probably say this is not okay. That would be the processing of the information. And then we would produce a response based on the interpretation of that information. So we interpreted this as a not okay sound. Our response would be to get up and leave the room. Okay, so that's just a basic example. And those things happen throughout the day constantly. So areas that are impacted include attention, learning, behavior, fine and gross motor skills, handwriting, feeding, emotional regulation, and social skills. So this is an old school, you can see the copyright date of 1991, a model of what we're really talking about here. So as parents, as educators, as people who work with kids, this is what we see at the top here, the cognition, the intellect. So we look at the learning skills, how well do they do in school? What are the kids' grades? Do they do their homework? And then daily living activities. And those are things that we just, we play as kids, we play, we interact, we complete our schoolwork, we do things at home like bathing and dressing and eating and chores. And then we, of course, look at those behaviors. So these are all things that we look at on a daily basis. But if you look down here, really, these 7 basic sensory systems, these are the foundation for a child's ability to do these things up here. And so if we have something that's not stable or working efficiently down here, it's really challenging for a kid to work efficiently at the top here. So these are really the foundation of the building blocks for skill development. Okay. So let's talk about the social emotional impact. So all behaviors serve a purpose and communicate. I think most of us know that. Things we might see are avoidance. Avoidance might be through tantrums or meltdowns, or tantrums or meltdowns just are happening. Decreased ability to make and sustain friendships. Kids might be dubbed the bully. He might or she might be dubbed the class clown. Kids start to develop self-esteem issues, it's poor self-image, and we often hear "I can't" statements. And as we talk about today, we're going to revisit this at the end of the seminar today to say, okay, these are some of the reasons why we're seeing these things. So we also look at sensory processing as we have sensory seekers and we have sensory avoiders. So the sensory seekers, they tend to be responsive to sensation. So they're constantly touching and moving. They want more, 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 more. And one thing we always teach people is to give kids the sensation they seek. If we have kids who are moving constantly, what's our tendency? We say, stop moving, sit still, right? But if a kid needs that sensation, then we want to find appropriate ways for them to get that. We also might see avoiders or kids who are over responsive. So they're sensitive, they're resistant to touch, visual and auditory input and movement. So they might enter that fight, or we also often just say the fight or flight state. And I think most people are familiar with that, but there's also a fright state where kids just shut down. So sometimes we see kids go into that state. And one thing I wanted to mention too, before we get going on each sensory system, is that we all have different sensory needs. Sometimes people say, oh, is that a sensory thing? Well, sure it is. We all have different needs for sensory input. We all might avoid certain things. And there's normalcy to that. So oftentimes the question is, well, how do we know if it's a problem or what's normal? And the answer I will give you is that it's when it disrupts a child or an adult's ability to function, it disrupts daily activities, that's when we want to investigate and determine if sensory processing challenges are bigger than just the norm of sensory seeking or avoiding. Okay, so let's talk about the tactile system. And as you guys, if you have questions that we'll talk about at the end, if you could just mention before your question, let's save your question on tactile system. If you could say tactile system and then ask the question, that will help me answer the question better and have a point of reference for your question at the end. So our tactile or our touch system, it helps us to discriminate and protects. It perceives pain and temperature and pressure. It tells us, what is it? Is this a spider? Is this a string on my arm? Is it okay or not okay? It helps us to localize touch. So I know I get touched right here on my arm. It facilitates body awareness, which impacts motor coordination. So signs you might see of a child who has trouble with processing touch input. A child might be irritated by tags and clothing, dislikes being hugged or touched. He or she might hit a peer in response to light touch. That kid might perceive that touch by a peer as an assault. So they perceived it as not okay, and they are going to react with a fight or flight response. So the kid looks aggressive because he just doesn't like the touch, but really his sensory system said that was not okay, and he goes into protective mode. He might avoid getting his hands messy. She might become upset if her face is messy. Kids don't like or become upset if clothes or socks are twisted. They might have trouble with transitions, and they tend to overreact to pain. Okay, so those are kids who are over responsive and sensitive. Then we have kids who are on the other end where they don't seem to notice if their socks or clothes are twisted. They underreact to pain. These are kids who might have a big boo-boo and they don't even react, they don't cry. And we don't know that they're really truly hurt or how significantly they're hurt because they're not reacting in a manner that would be, what we would think in relationship to the actual injury. They tend to not notice if their hands or face or clothes are messy. So these are kids who might have PB&J on their face after lunch and they have no idea, or it's all over their clothes. Constantly touching objects or people. They, again, want more, more, more. They want to know how things feel. They might be mouthing or chewing on non-food objects. And again, I want to say that, again, we all have our own sensory needs, and they're obviously for different ages or different expectations. So what we would expect from a 2, 3, 4-year-old is different that from an older elementary kid, middle school kid, and even adult. And oftentimes we do get, as we present this information, have parents say, oh my gosh, this is me. Either as a child or currently they still have some of these sensory needs. And again, that's okay. We just look at, does it disrupt your function and your abilities to perform your duties each day? So some strategies you can use if you're noticing a kid has some tactile processing challenges is using fidget toys. There are oodles and oodles and oodles of fidget toys out there, from the Dollar Tree to other stores or online. Um, there are so many options these days for kids, but they can be, look at the texture your kids like. Is it squishy or smooth or bumpy? A lot of times a strategy we'll use is just taking a strip of Velcro and putting under the table, the desktop, so a kid can sit and just rub, his or her fingers under the top, because that's not noticeable. And so that's a more subtle way to get some touch input. Tactile keychains, tactile strips. Now there are calm strips out there now that are really fantastic, and a lot of them are stickers, and you can just put them on, again, on a desk, on a binder, on a phone. There are just so many options, again, for kids and adults who need that sensory input. Tactile bins, we're really big fans of having opportunities for kids to just get their hands in and explore that. It can be very calming and soothing for some kids. Some kids don't like that, and the goal is to progress them so that they are okay with those sensations and their bodies aren't overreacting to that. Okay, the visual system. So vision is more than 20/20. It's not just, does a child need glasses or not need glasses? When we look at vision, we look at how are the eyes actually working together and how is that information processed. And so the visual system does a whole lot of things. It looks at lights and colors and patterns and print and movement and body language. And what it has to do is take all that information and process that. And again, determine, what am I seeing? What's this perception of my world around me? So we might have kids who have challenges with being in bright lights. They might be sensitive, they squint, they blink, they cover their eyes. So think about, again, if a kid isn't liking that, what kind of emotional behavioral reactions might you see because of that? Reading and writing and math skills tend to be a challenge. These, the guys have to constantly work together. And think about kids who are school age. There are constant visual input. There are letters on the page that are just constantly being like imposed on them, things on the wall. There's just so much each day. And I think, again, the visual system is so critical. I had many years ago had a little boy who was 8 years old, and he academically excelled, but he had a lot of anxiety. And so I just did some quick visual things with him and asked him a couple questions, and then we determined that he was actually seeing double. And so he was a very functional kid, with respect to doing well in school, but it was challenging and it was causing anxiety and creating those behavioral and emotional reactions. And so once he was able to remedy that, his anxiety levels went down, his academic skills, he was still doing well academically, obviously, but that stress and anxiety dissipated. So again, we're looking at that from not just the functional, but also that emotional behavioral reaction that kids might have. Kids might be distractible. Eye contact can be challenging. If you think about when you're looking at someone's face, if you guys were in front of me right now and I were looking at you, if you were close to me, I wouldn't just see your face. I would see, your eyes, nose, mouth, hair, clothes, everything around you too. I see the background as well. And so that's a lot of information to take in for kids. And so sometimes it's easier for the visual system just to say, okay, too much, and I'm going to look away. And so eye contact can be really challenging for a lot of the kids we work with. Handwriting will be affected. There's a lot of visual component to handwriting. Puzzles, finding objects within a background. So you might have a kid in your house or at your school where you say, hey, go, get your socks, and the kid's looking around. I don't see them. And they're right in front of them. Because it's just, they can't discriminate with their visual system. Okay, so strategies that you can use to help with visual challenges is, just take note of the lighting in the room. Is it too bright for a child? Is it too dim for a child? Determine if there's too much on the walls. And this is particularly true in classrooms, because we know that teachers really love to display all the awesome classwork that kids do, and kids do love seeing that. But for some kids, it's too much and it can be overwhelming. Um, and same in your home, in a child's bedroom, is there just too much? And I think a lot of times for kids, when they are expected to go clean their bedrooms, they walk in and there's just too much to look at and it's overwhelming and they just avoid the tasks. So that again, we get some behavioral responses because and there are a lot of other reasons for this. I'm not saying it's just visual, but there's there could be a behavioral reaction because it's visually overwhelming, or all the other reasons too. Covering portions of academic work. This can be really, really helpful for kids who get overwhelmed when they're looking at, like, let's say a worksheet or a book, and they have there's all these words, all these math problems. If you can just take a paper and cover up a portion of it so they can only see a bit at a time, that can be super helpful for kids. I know I remember, again, years ago, I worked with a little boy who was in kindergarten, and his mom reported that he was just having meltdowns constantly at school, and at home with homework because he just was, and that's what she said. So she showed me it was really honestly a half piece of paper, but there was so much on that half piece of paper that we said that's why he looks at it and he shuts down. And so they worked on covering portions of that, and that's helped him significantly. Considering using colored overlays for reading and using a visual schedule for kids who are reliant on visual input. Some avoid, some really are more visually oriented. And so using a visual schedule to help them know and plan their day can be very helpful for kids. Okay, so our auditory system. Again, our auditory system, it's not can a child hear or not hear. We work under the assumption that hearing structures are working. They're within the normal limits. But we look at how does that auditory system process information? How well do we tune in and tune out information? Our auditory system allows us to tune into voices. And so right now, hopefully you're tuning into my voice and tuning out other extraneous noises. Here in my house, there's someone actually with a chainsaw in the backyard. And so I'm tuning that out, and hopefully you all can't hear that. But if you can, hopefully you're tuning that out as well. But that's important. We need to tune out, the humming of the air conditioning, the humming of the lights. Sometimes, we'll hear those. Some of our kids could not tune that out. They hear the light and they have to tune in. Or there's the subtle hum of my computer right now, and I'm fortunately able to tune that out. If I can't, though, my brain's saying, oh, that's important. I need to pay attention. That's important. And therefore, I'm tuning out important voices, such as a teacher or a parent giving information that I need to have. And so sometimes that looks like disobedience. Sometimes that looks like we're ignoring. But sometimes it truly is kids just aren't able to tune into what's important and tune out the unimportant extra information. Again, allows us to listen and tune into the sounds of the environment, and things that are important might be like a police car or a fire engine or the ambulance. We need to be able to tune into that and say, oh, important. And we also need to be able to orient to where that sound is coming from. And so that we can move, as adults, we can move out of the way if we're driving, but also to alert us to the fact that there's something important happening. So again, our auditory system allows us to identify sounds. So we know all those things we just talked about, what they are. And again, is it important? Not important. It helps us to localize sounds too. Again, if we're in the environment, we need to know if we hear a big boom or we hear one of those, emergency vehicles, from which direction is that coming? And that helps us. We have to have good body awareness to know that. And our auditory system helps us have body awareness to know for which direction. So if we need to move out of the way, then we know which way to go. It's really hard for me not to say. Do you guys have any questions? I'm hoping you do have some questions and we can talk about at the end. Okay, so signs that we might see. A child might be slow to respond to his name or directives. And so, you might, let me go through these and we'll go back. So following 2 to 3 step directions might be difficult. Distractibility. So those things, if you have a kiddo in your home or in your school or that you work with in your life, that you say, Bobby, Bobby, and Bobby doesn't orient to that your sound of your voice, we want to look at, obviously, first of all, are hearing structures working? Is he within the normal limits for hearing? And then if so, then we say, okay, he is not processing that auditory information. Following 2 to 3 step directions. Maybe we say it's time to get your shoes on, get your backpack, and go to the car. Sometimes kids can follow one of those. Sometimes they can follow two. Sometimes they don't do any. They just stand there and look at you because that was too many words for them to process all of those steps in a given moment. And so, I had a little girl. I've had kids, I should say, not just a little girl. I've had kids where, I'll give a direction and I'll say, what did my word say? And this is when we're starting a therapy session. And the kid might say, I say, what did my word say? And the kid might say, you said go to the trampoline. And you can tell by their body language and their inflection of their voice that they are making an assumption based on routines, what I probably asked them to do. But they auditorily did not process the information. And so that's something we want to be cautious with when are kids truly following, or processing information and following directions, or are they following their peers or looking? These are also kids who look around to see what's happening in the room. Oh, okay, it's time to transition to snack time now. And so, oh, it's time for me to pick up my book, close my book, and put stuff away. And they really didn't hear the directions. They're just doing what they're seeing cues from their peers, and based on routines that they know. Kids might be distractible again. If I can't tune out all the extra noises in my environment, then I'm going to be looking around and really having a hard time of tuning into what you're saying. Kids also might be sensitive to sounds. This is an auditory processing challenge that we see a lot of in our therapy center. Toilets flushing, fire alarms, school bells, dogs barking. I just talked to a little girl who says every time her dog barks, it makes her body vibrate. That's pretty intense. And so we've got to work through that with her. But these are things that kids, you might just see some kids just cover their ears. Some kids will avoid an environment. Some kids avoid going to the bathroom. They avoid toileting because of the sound of the toilet flushing or because of the sound of the hand dryer. And so these are things, obviously, these are sensory things that are impacting a child's ability to function. Kids might be distracted by the background sounds. We talked about that earlier. They also might have speech or articulation difficulties. Okay, I'm checking my time here. Okay, I think I have to talk a little quicker. Sorry, guys. Okay, so these are some strategies. I think these are super important for all of us. These are things that I had to use with my own son for a period of time when he was younger. And I've been doing this for so many years that you think it would be natural, but it's something you have to practice. Give your child time to respond. So kids who have, there is actually a diagnosis called central auditory processing disorder, where kids can be diagnosed with auditory delays and processing challenges. And so kids who have that diagnosis can have up to a 10 to 15-second delay in processing of information. Now, a kid doesn't have to have a diagnosis to have these delays. But with that being said, my kid was a 5-second delay kid. I would say his name and I would count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then he would turn his head and say, yes, mommy. And so it was very fascinating for me to see. And sometimes, it's as an adult with a kid, when you give a direction, you kind of expect a quicker response, right? If I ask you to do something, you want them to do it. And you expect a pretty quick response. So if you have a kid, who you're wondering if this is a challenge, just give some time. The trick with this is that usually 15 other things happen in those 5 seconds that might distract the child or happen that causes them to do something, move on. But I do challenge you to do this. Count out loud to yourself, or make it, count on your fingers. So you're really making an active effort to give child time to process that information and respond. Simplifying directions, limiting your words can be very helpful. So instead of saying, okay, guys, it's time to get your shoes on, get your backpack and go to the car, you can say shoes, backpack, car. Limit the words. It gives the kid an opportunity to process that information more easily. And then asking your kid to repeat the directions. Again, what did my words say? Or what were the steps that you're supposed to do? And see if he can repeat those back to you. If he can't, that means he did not process those pieces of information. If he's able to repeat them, then you know that for this moment anyway, he got those pieces of information and now you want him to follow through with it. And that's a different set of skill. And so I think that those are really 3 big things we recommend to parents trying with their kids. I know they can be very powerful and effective for a lot of our kids that we work with. And so I really encourage you to try those. Using visual schedules can also be helpful for kids who may not be processing all the verbal cues that you're giving, all the verbal information, just giving visual pictures of what's expected can be very helpful. Okay. So proprioception, that's a big word. And really, it's just the system that gives us awareness from joints and muscles and tendons. It facilitates body awareness and tells us how much force to use when completing a task. So this is the force, the system, the sensory system that tells us when we do a handshake or a high five, how much force do I need to use? Some kids do really hard high fives. Sometimes it's on purpose because they like to watch adults wince, but sometimes they don't have the ability to grade that force. These are kids who might throw a ball to you like so hard when you're not that far away. Um, and again, sometimes it's because they think it's funny, but a lot of times it's kids don't have the ability to grade the force. So this would be the sensory system that tells you if I'm holding a raw egg, how much force do I need to use to hold this? If I use too much, then the egg gets smushed. If I use the right amount of force, I can successfully carry that egg. So things we might see if kids are having challenges processing proprioceptive input are that they might be clumsy and awkward. They might act out during structured motor activities because things are really challenging, and so it's easier to avoid and act up. This is where you might see that class clown, come into play because they're just going to be silly and avoid. This is kind of with all these things, but we often see it with the motor activities. Academic too. Let me say that true. Bumping into things frequently, they don't have good body awareness and they can't control themselves, so they're bumping into things. Learning new motor tasks are difficult for kids, or is difficult for kids who have these challenges. They might seem weaker than other kids. They tire easily with physical activity. They avoid, again, I already mentioned that, the gross motor and fine motor activities. They also might be wiggly in their chair. This could also come from vestibular, which we'll talk about in a little bit. They might drool beyond the expected age. So, we're past the teething age. We might have our mouth open because we don't have good awareness of our oral structures. And so we might be drooling. They might be messy and stuffing food in their mouth. They also might mouth and chew on non-food items. So there's a whole another page. So this is a pretty important system. They might have an awkward pencil grasp. These are kids who hold the pencil, in a really, I have the pencil here. I was going to show you, but I lost it. Like this or upside down. And so they just don't have good input through that sensory system to tell them, how to hold that pencil. Tactile system also comes into play with the pencil grasp. Increased or decreased pencil pressure. So these are kids who cannot use mechanical pencils because every time they do, they break the lead or break crayons. And they're pushing really too hard. Or there are kids who, you can barely see what they've written because the pressure is too light. Posture can be affected. They're slow to complete tasks like such as dressing or eating. Bathing could be too. Crashing into people intentionally. So there's some of that's bumping, it's unintentional. They don't have good body awareness. Sometimes it just feels good to get that extra crash into something. So these are kids who crave rough play. They might tend to break objects when playing with them because they don't have the right amount of force. So they might push when they should pull or twist. And then they tend to break things. These kids also could appear lazy. And I can tell you that kids are not inherently lazy. If you have a kid in your life that you think, oh, the kid's just lazy, let's think about all these sensory systems and find out what could be impacting him or her that causes him to look lazy. So activities that you can do include heavy work activities. So these are any activities where there's a push and a pull. And I always like to use, activities where when you get an exhale from a kid, then that tells you you've gotten a really good heavy work activity. In the home, it could be pushing a mop or a vacuum or pushing a toy box or a laundry basket full of clothing. We do recommend no more than 5 to 10% of the kid's body weight just to make sure injuries don't occur. Chair push-ups are helpful. Kids put their hands down and they just push themselves up and down. Wall push-ups. They push the walls out. Just make sure it's not a movable wall. I've done that before. Hand pushes and pulls. London Bridge with a pier where they're just pushing. That makes my hands look really big when I do that. Push against someone else. That's really good, especially if you do that with a kid, it's really powerful. There's some fun with that, some peer interaction. You just want to make sure kids don't end up doing this, that they actually get a good push from their shoulders. Pushing or pulling or carrying weighted objects. I kind of mentioned some of those already previously. Any activity that provides resistance to arms, legs, or whole body. Exercise bands are great. We really like recommending that for schools, or when kids are seated for a long period of time, putting it around the chair leg. So if you have a chair leg, you wrap the band around, you can't see that like that, and then kids can kick their feet against it, or bounce their feet on it. If kids put their feet behind it, I just recommend that they get a reminder to put their feet on the other side before they stand up, and so they don't fall. Using a sitting wedge or an exercise ball can be very helpful. Okay, vestibular. So this is located in our inner ear. It's our movement and balance sense. It gives information about movement of our head in relationship to gravity. It tells us if we're sitting up, if we're falling over, if we're spinning in circles. It gives information about speed and direction of movement. This is our sensory system that tells us if we like roller coasters or do not like roller coasters. And it also integrates all of our other senses. If we don't have good vestibular processing, it's hard for us to have good orientation of where we are in space. It affects our emotional security and well-being, and it affects our visual system, our auditory system. So it's really important that we make sure this system is working really well and efficiently for kids. Signs you might see if a kiddo is not really processing vestibular information very well is that the kid is always on the go, seeking movement activities such as swinging and merry-go-rounds. And so again, this is really important because we want kids to be active, but if it's disrupting a child's ability to participate in the expected activities, then we look at it, wonder, is this a concern? Enjoys climbing, and usually we say, at the risk of his own safety. Difficulty remaining seated in a chair. So sometimes kids, again, are constantly moving. Those are kids who really benefit from the wiggle wedges. Sometimes kids will just fall out of chairs. A lot of times, classroom teachers will report a kid just fell out of his chair, and that's just, astounding to them. But this is because their vestibular system, if it's not because they're trying to get attention and be silly for other reasons, it's because their vestibular system just didn't allow them to maintain that upright position, and they lost sense of where they were in space, and they went kerplunk. Kids might enjoy spinning. And again, this is not something, if you see a kid spinning, it doesn't mean like, oh my gosh, this kid has a child. I loved standing in my living room, spinning, and laying down and watching the ceiling spin. I thought that was the best thing ever. Now I would vomit, but at the time it was completely a normal activity. My body enjoyed it. It craved it. I was in gymnastics. I did things like that. And so that's, again, within normal. I didn't do that when I was supposed to be sitting in the classroom listening to a teacher, or when I was on the basketball court. I just did it because it was something that I enjoyed doing. It didn't disrupt my daily activities. Kids might, on the flip side of this, they might avoid climbing. They may be hesitant to climb on playground equipment. And this is concerning because we want kids to be active and moving. If a kid is fearful of, going on a swing or climbing up to a slide, or having his or her feet off the ground, that's concerning to us as well. These kids might sit slumped or propped on their arms. They have difficulty identifying right and left of their body. So things you can do are make sure you're getting movement breaks for kids if they're seated in the classroom for long periods of time in the day. Windmills, I don't know how many of you out there remember old fashioned, like you have your arms out, you bend down and touch one toe, come up, bend down, touch the other toe. Making sure the head is actually going up and down is the important part of that. Honestly, just doing head rolls, tipping in one direction or the other, jumping up and down, any rolling, twisting, turning, those are going to be good movement break strategies for kids who have been sitting for a long time. Touch and smell, I'm going to go through really quickly. I think we all know about taste, the different systems. Olfactory is important because I'm going to jump to it is tied to memory, which can affect behavioral and emotional reactions. And I just think this is interesting and important for people to know that, think about if you smell an apple pie, it goes right to the limbic system, which is our emotional memory system. And that ties us to grandmas at Christmas, or, pumpkin pie is Thanksgiving. And so it's important because it can impact kids on a level, and it's harder to identify that because you may not know what a kid associates that with. But I had a little girl who had been adopted at the age of 2 from a Russian orphanage. And when she was 12, she went to a summer camp and came home in a meltdown every single day and was just distraught and said, I can't go back. And mom went the next day to see what was going on. And as she went down the hallway, she turned the corner and she said there was a smell, and she thinks it was the cleaners that smelled like the Russian orphanage. And so this little girl did not have any direct, recall of that, and she couldn't identify that. But it was just that that limbic emotional memory center, it triggered her to like a traumatic response. So again, those are really hard to identify, but it's as part of like my job as an occupational therapist is to kind of be a detective and figure out why kids are having some challenges with different areas. And sometimes it might be a smell related thing. So things you might see are deliberately smelling objects, overly sensitive to odors, licking, sucking, chewing on non-food items past the age of 18 months. Kids might be picky eaters. And there are a lot of reasons for picky eaters. This just happens to fall under this as one reason. And they might crave intense flavors, sour, spicy. I had a little boy who was 2 or 3, and he would eat those little pearled onions straight out of the jar. And he like craved intense flavors. And then I had a little guy who was a school age kid who, this is when I worked in schools. He, we had lemonade powder, and he would have put it straight on his tongue, and he would do this whole shiver, shiver, shiver. And he'd say, that was fantastic. And it helped him focus and organize, and he could do his work. It was the funniest thing, but those things can be very powerful for kids who crave those intensities. Okay, so I'm going to briefly touch on interoception. Oh, we're doing good on time. I talked really quickly, so we're good. Processing. This is the internal body awareness. So processing of sensation from our internal systems, internal bodily sensations. So it tells us, are we hungry or thirsty? It gives us information from bowel and bladder. It tells us about body temperature. Am I hot? Am I cold? We have a lot of kids who have difficulty with temperature regulation. Heartbeat. Do I know that my heart's racing, or do I feel calm? Breathing. Do I know if I'm breathing? Because some of our kids hold their breaths. Am I breathing really quickly? Am I breathing shallowly? Am I getting deep breaths? And so that's important information. I actually didn't create a slide to talk about what to do about it, because I can just tell you it's about increasing that overall body awareness. So all the things we've talked about, all those sensory systems really need to be working effectively and efficiently to help kids have good interoception. Even for adults, we have to have good awareness of our body. And so we do that in therapy through improving body awareness with all the things we just talked about. And there's some active things, intentional things you can do about really having a kid or an adult think about, and paying attention to and tuning into those body systems, and that increasing that awareness. I know a lot of people do a lot of mindfulness activities to help with that. But that's what that's about. But it can be, again, it's been put into the one of the 8 sensory systems we work on now. And so it's something we don't want to forget about. Okay, let's revisit this. So again, all the things we just talked about, all those skills that are required for kids. So, and I probably should have said this at the beginning, but as an occupational therapist, my job is to look at kids' jobs. And what are kids' jobs? Their jobs each day are to, get out of bed, get dressed, complete their, do their daily activities such as eating, bathing, dressing, brushing teeth, all those self-care tasks, going to school, having the organization, the executive function skills to have all the tools they need for their classroom, to do the learning, to do the schoolwork that's expected, to participate in PE and recess and socially interact with peers, emotionally regulate throughout the day. And so when kids have challenges with any of those jobs, it's my job to figure out what's the underlying cause. And so again, this is what we look at. We look at all these different sensory systems. We look at additional things too, such as reflex integration. But this is what we really look at, and this is what we're measuring on a day-to-day basis. So again, think about all those things we just looked at that we talked about kids might have challenges with, but these are really the things that we need to make sure are working well. And again, going back to the social emotional impact, again, I think this is, I will say probably 90% of the clients we get, one of the top 3 things that kids are challenged with these days is emotional regulation. And this is from kids who are 4 to 15. We see a wider range of kids than that, but those are the kids that really, one of the top 3 primary reasons they're coming in to see us is because of emotional regulation. And usually it's one of these things. And so again, we want to look at all behaviors serve a purpose and communicate. Avoiding. Why would a kid avoid? Is it because things are too loud? They're too bright? I don't like, you know what? I don't like going to this class because this particular student gets too close and in my space and he touches me. And I don't like how that feels. Is it because visually the paper, there's too much on there? Is it because the teacher's voice is too loud? Or maybe some voices just people don't like the frequency of certain voices. You know, there are all those variables that we have to look into if we're looking at why kids are avoiding things. Is it related to sensory systems? Tantrums and meltdowns, again, are we avoiding because we are just overwhelmed? We've reached our max capacity. One thing that we often teach too is that, you know, when kids are sensory sensitive, it might not just be like one little thing. It might be that accumulation of things that have happened over the day. So it might be that, you know, I woke up and I had to put on these itchy, scratchy jeans. And so I started here, ground zero, and now I'm here. And then I had to eat that cereal and it got mushy and I didn't like how it felt in my mouth. And now I'm here. And by the way, usually kids can't verbalize this. Sometimes they can, but sometimes they don't know. And then I got in the car and my brother was bumping against me in the car, back seat. And now I'm like this. And then I got to school and the bell rang. Ugh. And then the next thing is I'm standing in line and a peer bumps into me. Ugh. You know, here was my max. I went up the ladder and I exploded. And so I have a meltdown. I have a tantrum. And maybe I punched the kid who bumped into me accidentally. But I was going up that ladder and it was just too much. I exploded. And so we want to look at that and determine it probably wasn't just one event. Sometimes it is. It's just enough to have one thing. But usually it's that accumulation of things happening over the course of time. We all do that. You know, usually we have something happens and we recover. We recover a bit. So maybe we don't fully melt down. But sometimes we do. We all get there. We just have had our max and we lose it. And oftentimes kids keep it together at school and they save it for parents. So if you're a parent out there, I'm sorry, that's what they do because they feel safe. Not that they don't feel safe at school, but you are their pure, true safety person. And so they save it for you and then they melt down or they get angry and have fits. So how does this affect friendships? You know, I don't want to be friends with you because you always bump into me and I'm interpreting that as an assault and you're attacking me. You don't want to be friends with me because I'm hitting you every time you touch me. And so it can cause some challenges with the friendships. Kids again might get dubbed the bully because they're actually reacting in a fight or flight response and protecting themselves. And maybe they're hitting or throwing or kicking or yelling. But really they're feeling like they're the ones being assaulted. Again, these are not the only reasons kids do these things, but if we're looking at it from the frame of sensory processing, this is what we're talking about. Class clown, again, it is so much easier for some of our kids just to be silly and act up and, you know, say things or do things in a classroom to avoid because too much on the paper. I don't know how to do this assignment. This is too tricky to hold the pencil this way. It is too hard to do these PE activities. So I'm just going to be silly. And kids do that, you know, throughout the course of their day. So of course, over time, these things will start to affect their self-image, so self-esteem, because, you know, when things are so hard constantly, kids get defeated. And so then we start hearing I can't statements, which always breaks my heart. So we like to catch kids before they get to that point, before they're really feeling that self-esteem being impacted, because it just, you know, it prevents that defeated nature and feeling. Okay, checking my time here. Okay, so these really, I'll quickly go through these ways to facilitate a calm alert state. This is things that can be done in the classroom, in a home, in the bedroom, in the dining room, whatever works for your environment. Dimming lights, having music playing like classical music or rhythmic drumming music, a metronome, they'll just tick. That can be very calming. Usually about 52 beats per minute is calming. Straw drinking, that sucking is very calming. So if you have an opportunity for your kid to drink through a straw, like a smoothie or even yogurt or pudding, applesauce, kids think that's really crazy. You stick a straw in the container and have them drink that. That's different. And it's also very calming because it's that sucking. If you think back into, you know, infancy, babies are soothed by sucking. And so it's true across the age spectrum that sucking can actually be calming and organizing. So straw drinking is really recommended for a lot of our kids. Providing a quiet corner, you know, that can look like so many different things. There are a lot of great products out there now You can pop up tents, but you can also just take a sheet and stick it in the corner and drape it down and put calming things in there. Providing resistive activities like this is prior to a challenging event. So if you know a child's gonna be challenged with an activity or going someplace, doing something, do some of these activities like the resistive work we talked about. Chewing on things like bubble gum is really effective. Even younger kids, we can teach them how to chew bubble gum and it can be very powerful for them. Providing a blowing activity like party blowers, those quiet ones, the ones that unravel, make sure it's quiet, not the loud ones. Kazoos, those are loud, but those are fun. Bubble monsters, one of my all-time favorite activities for calming. Just take some dish soap and water, take a straw. The silly straws are the best, and have kids blow. You of course want to make sure they're not going to suck it and drink it. We always practice that. But make sure they're going out as long as they can. I count for kids. One, two, three, and just see how long they can extend their exhale. That can be very calming. Because a lot of times, to be honest, if we have kids practice their breathing, we say, take a deep breath, they really extend their exhale, and they can do that through different blowing activities. Again, chewy foods, foods to suck on, crunchy foods, foods with intense flavors, drinking from sports bottles, silly straws. I already talked about the thick drinks and the bubble gum. So the oral system can be very calming and organizing for all of us, to be honest. If you think about people chew on pens, fingers, gum, food, we put things in our mouth to help calm, and that can be very powerful for kids as well. So we want to think about that and choose snacks and foods that can really be therapeutic for them if they're needing that. Okay, so these are some resources. There are so many resources out there now that these are actually kind of the originals that we used to always go to. So I thought I'd bring those back up because I think there is so much out there. Sometimes it's too much, but these are kind of the basic ones that were kind of the original go-tos. And so I really encourage people, if you want to explore more, to pick up one of these to read. It's my website. You're welcome to email me with questions, and if I can answer them through an email, I'm happy to do that. But sometimes you might have to seek out an occupational therapist in your area. Okay, I think, Christina, that's it. Do we have questions?
Yes, we do have questions, Carrie. So thank you so much. That was so informative. We do have a bunch, so we don't have much time, so I'm gonna take 2 or 3. And hopefully we could just get through those. And as Carrie said, if you guys do have questions, please email her them. So one of our questions is it true that sensory issues are consistent regardless of where someone is? My 6-year-old daughter has complete meltdowns getting dressed because of how her clothes fit, even items that felt fine the day before. But once she's dressed and out the door, it's no longer a force or issue for her. Because it's specific to just getting ready to leave for school or hockey, would that suggest it's not a sensory processing disorder / sensitivity and something else? And when I say meltdown, I mean she's ripping the items off as if they are painful. It looks and sounds dramatic, but she is beside herself as it's happening, not intentionally.
Wow. Yeah. I'm sorry she's dealing with that and that you're dealing with that. I think absolutely we would rule that as that's a sensory processing challenge. Just because what's happening is there's some worry, anxiety, stress about getting those on and how it's going to feel. And it's not uncommon for kids, even adults, like once you have it on, your body habituates to that and then you're okay, you can move forward. And probably the activity she's going to, if it's hockey or whatever, it's motivating enough that she can overcome that worry and that stress and her nervous system is okay and she can move forward with it. But the fact that she's having such a big reaction tells me that that's triggering that fight or flight response. And that we don't want her to be at that level because that means her stress response is going up and we don't want her to experience such a bigger stress response with getting clothes on. So just because it's not carrying over, that doesn't mean that's not truly a sensory processing issue. So I would definitely seek out somebody in your area to get some, testing. And there might be some other things that are sensory issues that maybe you're not really seeing right now that maybe today after today, hopefully you've thought about that. But definitely if, again, the thing is that that's causing such a big reaction, we want to make sure that we minimize that for her. And feel free to email me if you have more questions on that.
Yes. Our next question is, my 3-year-old son is autistic. He has a major food aversion. We work with an occupational therapist, but it's a slow process. He doesn't know to chew, will only try new foods by licking it from a fork. Doesn't like to touch food. He will only swallow, so he eats oatmeal for breakfast and dinner, and his lunch, lentils, rice, veggies, meat, is blended in a processor, and he drinks milk. How can I get him to try new things and teach him to chew?
So the chewing, the feeding is such a hard one. So many reasons why kids don't want to eat. And I don't think it doesn't sound like it's just a sensory thing with him. The jaw, there's a lot of proprioception, a lot of input that has to happen there. So I would encourage you to talk with your therapist and see if he or she has tried just even chewing on like chewy tubes. We have a lot of oral tools we use to help with that, but see if he will chew on something that's not a food item. Cause I'm worried, wondering if he's worried about how, I chew it and then what do I do with it? Because the thing about chewing too is it's not just my jaw I have to have enough input and awareness to use my muscles in my jaw to chew, but also my tongue has to know what to do with that food as I'm chewing. And I have to know once I chew it up that my tongue needs to move from side to side, and then I have to pull it back to the back of my throat and swallow. And so I think there are a lot of things involved there, like some steps before food. So one thing we do, I mean, it sounds like, I'm so glad you're with a therapist because that's obviously the best step. But I think also just, I don't know, one thing, I don't know if he'll do it from the touch part of it, but like we've done before, like we'll put gum in like cheesecloth or gauze and see if they can chew on that, because that gets some input. The flavor, the texture of that isn't always great. Some kids don't care. But see if you can even get the chewing motion from anything. It could be, a game I like to try too is we call it bite and tug, where we'll take a chewy tube. You can also use like a washcloth, which again, there's some sensory involved with that, but put it on his jaw, back of his teeth, his molars, and see if he'll just pull on it. Um, that obviously we don't want to teach putting non-food items in the mouth, depending on what his level of understanding of that. But we also want to make sure that he's getting that input through his jaw. I would even just doing some deep massage on his jaw to increase some awareness of his jaw muscles. But I think the feeding's a tough thing. I think, we do like you said, they'll lick things, licking, kissing. Sometimes we'll put food in the mouth and then just we call them blowing rockets. That's like a K2Me approach, SOS approach. Blow it into the trash can. Again, sometimes we have to watch, is it teaching one thing, going to teach something different we don't want them to learn? But those are some strategies I'm thinking of off the top of my head. But I definitely think they're sensory, but there's probably some motor and motor coordination issues with that too. I hope that helps. Feel free to email me.
Thanks,
Right,
Carrie.
Christina,
And
we have more?
I think we have time for just one more. It is, do all children who have been diagnosed with dyslexia have visual processing difficulties? Can this be treated?
That is a great question. I'm going to say I don't know the answer for sure. I haven't read enough research to know that answer to give you definitively, but I know that a lot of kids we work with do have visual processing challenges, and there is something called vision therapy. And we do make referrals to a vision therapist in our area. We as OTs in our center, we work on a lot of visual skills that can help with that. But sometimes kids need, like, things get out of our scope of practice and they need to have a referral to a developmental optometrist to really go to the next level if it's significant enough that what we're doing isn't making changes. So I would absolutely recommend finding a developmental optometrist in your area to get an evaluation to determine that.
Amazing. Thank you, Carrie. That is our time for today. Carrie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you
We'd like
all.
to remind all the participants that there will be a recording sent out following today's session, as well as a survey that will be popping up when this talk ends. So if you would please take a minute to provide us with your feedback, we'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you everyone again for joining us, and we hope to see you all next month. Our next Kidco talk is on December 11th, and we hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you all. Email me if you have questions.
Thank you,
Thanks.
everyone. Thank you, Carrie.
Bye. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Christina. Bye.